Chapter 7. The happy glow from the tea party stayed with Anne for days. Everything seemed to go better. David stopped teasing and even went out of his way to be nice. One evening, as he saddled the 2 horses to give them the exercise, he invited Anne to come along for a ride. It was one of those clear, beautiful September days when the sun can hardly bear to leave the world, and when it does, it sends up a harvest moon just as round as golden as it is. David and Anne rode down the eastern side of the hill, past Uncle John Hamilton's cabin. "Don't come this far alone for a while, Anne," David said. "The Doane gang is loose in the county, probably farther west, but better not to take any chances." "I'll be careful," Anne promised. "But tell me, David, if a man's a horse thief, can you tell just by looking at him?" David smiled. "Generally, if a man's wicked, he can't keep the wickedness out of his face any more than a good man can hide his goodness. But don't count on that. Second-rate material can be tied up in a pretty package, too. Just don't get friendly with any strangers for a while." As David talked, he turned his horse off of the road into the woods. "We're taking a shortcut," he said, "and I want to show you something." Anne had never been through these woods before. The trees were bigger than they were on the top of the hill. The 2 horses wove their way in and out among them, while Anne and David reached for clusters of wild grapes whenever they dangled low. "Taste good," and David mumbled as he popped a grape into his mouth. "Wild grapes are a sure sign of rich soil." Pretty soon, Anne thought, he is going to tell me where he has hidden my diary. Maybe he has the diary with him. Maybe for some strange reason he has even hidden it over here, and that was where we were going. That was where they were going. David pulled up his horse on the bank of a wild creek that suddenly broke the woods in 2. "Here we are," he said. The ground was so rocky now that only a few scattered trees were able to find a foothold. Great slabs of rock hung out over the creek and formed caves. David was looking towards the valley. "See the place way down there where the creek meets the road? Look at that flat stretch of valley to the left of the creek. Pretty, isn't it?" David smiled. "That's the spot where we're going to build our church someday." David looked at Anne's face, so proud and dreaming and happy, and she looked at the piece of land he was pointing to. She tried to picture a little log church nestling there, but the trees kept getting in the way. "It will be nice," Anne said. "Father, Daniel, Uncle John, and I decided the other day that was the spot it should be when the time comes." "Is that all you wanted to show me?" Anne asked. "That's it," David nodded, his eyes still on the valley. "It's nice," Anne repeated. Maybe on the way home David would tell her about the diary. Surely he would. But all the way home David didn't mention it. A golden pumpkin of a moon came up and turned the road into a strange and shimmering river. Perhaps the moonlight put everything else out of David's mind. Tomorrow, Anne thought as she went to bed. Tomorrow, if he doesn't say anything, I'll ask him. The next morning, it was clear right from the beginning that it was going to be an unusual day. When Mr. Hamilton went to the door to look at the weather, he went all the way outside and stayed a while. When he came in, he didn't call out his report in his town crier voice. He just mumbled to himself and shook his head. "Queer day," he said, "mighty queer." After breakfast, when Anne went outside to see for herself, she had to admit that the day was indeed queer. Long strings of gray clouds raced across the sky. The wind sighed and moaned along the tops of trees, but down below where Anne stood there was no wind at all. The air was still, motionless, waiting. A crow dropped down to the ground as if he had been thrown there and stood, breathless and confused in the quiet. Anne drew the shawl she was wearing closer around her shoulders. Then she saw Andy, walking towards the barn, leaning forward into a wind that strangely wasn't there. Suddenly, Anne didn't want to be alone for one more minute. "Andy," she called, "wait a minute." She ran to meet him and caught up to him by the barn. "What do you want?" he asked. Anne hesitated. She certainly didn't want him to know that for a moment she had been frightened by a peculiar wind and a black crow. "You haven't come for lessons," she said. Andy leaned against the barn. "Thought you were mad. You kicked up the last letters I wrote. I was hiding and I saw you. You were plenty mad then." "Yes, and for good reason," Anne snapped. Andy looked at the sky. "Still mad?" he asked. "Oh, I guess not so much." Anne thought she had never seen clouds stream across the sky so fast. Andy broke off a piece of long grass and put it in his mouth. "I won't have time for more lessons anyhow. We're leaving in a day or so. We're going over the mountains with your Uncle John when he goes east for supplies." Andy spit out the grass he was chewing. "I've got a piece of news," he said. He picked up a pebble from the ground and threw it as far as he could into the woods. Then he picked up another and tried to throw it even farther. He's acting with his piece of news like he did with the wild turkey, Anne thought, hiding it behind his back as long as he can. "Well, what is it?" Anne asked. "We're coming back in the spring," Andy announced proudly. "And we're a-going to plant. After working with your father, Pa thinks a farm isn't such a bad idea." "Oh, Andy, I'm so glad," Anne cried. "And I'll help you with your vegetable garden. You'll see." Andy picked up another pebble. This time he threw it high, and it went singing off into the treetops. "That ain't all," he said. "Pa says I can go to school this winter. When I come back, I'll likely be as educated as your old Arthur Scott." Educated as your old Arthur Scott. Andy filled his hands with small stones and rattled them together like marbles. "Say," he said suddenly, "why don't you come east too for the winter? You could go with us, stay with your cousin Margaret, and come back when we do." Anne drew in her breath sharply. "Oh, I couldn't," she said. "Why not?" Andy tossed the stones up and down in his hand. "It would only be for the winter. Not much to do on a farm in the winter anyway." "Only for the winter," Anne repeated to herself. "Like a visit." Then she shook her head. "They'd never let me." "You don't know until you ask, do you?" Andy began firing his stones one after another into the woods. "Why don't you ask?" "Maybe I will," Anne whispered slowly. All at once she was feeling as peculiar as the weather. Thoughts were streaking across her mind like the clouds in the sky. Did she really want to ask? Oh, but suppose they would allow her to go. Suppose... "You want to go, don't you?" Auntie interrupted. Of course, it was what she had always wanted, Anne thought. Only now, why did she feel so mixed up? "Just ask your folks," Andy repeated. "I've got to hurry. It's get a fierce storm before the day's over." Some of the clouds had long, black, ragged tails now, Anne noticed as she walked back to the cabin. The woods were swaying back and forth in one great movement, and the trees looked larger and taller than ever before.